This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. So I was, as a typical sort of absent-minded professor, I managed to not actually bring a copy of the book over. So I was is this coming through in the microphone? So I popped over to Foyles last night to see if I could pick up a copy. And at first I thought I wasn't going to be able to, because there's this great big philosophy section there, and it wasn't there. There was this clear space under where it should be under C. But then it turned out right at the end of the section there's a bit called ethics and a bit called metaphysics and epistemology, and what you would think of as contemporary analytics, basically all there, and there it was. And it wasn't that sort of none of the books that people here would read were in the philosophy section. There was this nice little sort of OUP version of the Meno that was there that was as philosophy, but it was that they seemed to think that what had been happening in at least recent years was this category in Anglo-American philosophy, well, in analytic philosophy, though in the last few years that's been less Anglo-American, was a categorically different thing to what had been going on before. And I don't think that's right. I don't think it's true that we're different in kind to what had been going on before. But I do think there's something interesting about identifying our place in the philosophical tradition. There is, at least it seems to me, intuitively, for want of a better word, that there's an era in philosophy that starts around 1970 with naming necessity, with theory of justice, with Montague and Cappelen, and then a lot of work by David Lewis, and it runs through to the present era. If that's right, it's actually quite a long era. So if you think about the sort of length of time that ordinary language philosophy or logical positivism or American pragmatism or British idealism or a lot of these other important eras lasted for, it's very hard to find sort of a 40-year heyday. So if it's right that there's a single period that sort of stretches from sort of 1970 to the present, it's quite a big one. It's not that we have some easy identification of it. I can tell you about if I just tell you about the time period of sort of British idealism or ordinary language philosophy, you can sort of pick a date and you can identify it easily enough. It's a bit harder to, or early analytic, it's a bit harder to come up with a nice snappy name for 1970 to 2013 and ongoing. David Armstrong somewhere calls it the age of conferences, which is, I think it's at least descriptively right, but doesn't quite seem to get to the heart of the matter. I've been trying to go around calling it late analytic, sort of on a par with Terry Eagleton talking about late modernism, but late modernity. But I don't know if that'll quite catch on. But then to give away the joke of the title, to me, what's at the heart of Herman's book is a really important contribution to this historical work on this recent period. Now you might think to sort of use sort of Jonathan Bennett's old joke that sort of historical work on the recent past was a much needed gap in the literature, that it was just so obvious what was going on that we didn't need to look back. I think that's wrong for a couple of reasons. One is it's quite easy to see, looking round about big debates and I think in some places big confusions about work from the very recent past. But also it's so hard to figure out just what's distinctive. It's very easy to say what's distinctive about the positivists. It's very easy to say what's distinctive about the ordinary language philosophers. It's not quite as easy to say what's distinctive about the sort of Kripke-Lewis onward period. You could say that it's got something to do with modality. That it's true that from around the early the 60s and 70s onwards, people became much more willing to give analyses in modal terms, to use modal locution, to use sort of unapologetically modal language. But then, I don't think that's sort of universal, and moreover, my sense is that if that was what was characteristic, then the era would to some extent have come to an end. At least in metaphysics, following on from Kit Fine's 2000 or 2001 paper, A Question of Realism, there's been a bit of a move away from thinking that you can sort of helpfully give modal explanations of a whole bunch of things. So I'm not so that's part of it, but it's not quite. I don't think quite all of it. It's certainly true that from that period I'm talking about, externalist theories in epistemology and in semantics become more and more prominent. Although it's also true that at least in philosophy of mind, they weren't exactly unknown before 1970 either. I mean, what you might be sort of thinking is sort of obvious is that, well, in this recent period, people use thought experiments and intuitions about thought experiments a lot. That what they do, that what's characteristic of recent work is that it's full of journal articles where people say, here's a cute little example, and this cute little example shows that your favorite theory is wrong. And I think that's not right for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's not like philosophers had never done this before, and I sort of mention once or twice. There's that methodology crops up, here in Plato occasionally. But as Herman goes over in some extent in his book, a lot of the discussion of these famous thought experiments doesn't consist of just presenting a case, presenting an intuition about it, and using that as an argument stopper. It's true that, and I think it's important that we talk about particular cases and we argue about cases, and I think without necessarily having enough historical knowledge to back this up, my sense is we focus on cases more than philosophers did in the past, but it's not that we do it by running intuitions. So let's try and make that a bit more determinate in good old-fashioned Socratic terms. So certainly in the Meno, but in other works too, Socrates looks like he's reasoning he's putting forward the following as a principle, that to know whether A is F, you have to know what F is. The example he gives is, look, you couldn't answer the question of whether Socrates was tall without knowing who Socrates was. Similarly, you can't answer a question of whether someone is just without knowing what justice is. As Geach sort of said, well, Geach's label for this, I don't know if that's original to Geach actually, but Geach's label for this was Socrates' fallacy, because this just seems obviously false. I can know that if I were to punch Herman in the face, that would be wrong, and I can know that without having the first clue of what a philosophical theory of wrongness would be. There's a couple of things you might say at this point if you're wanting to stand up for the importance of Socrates as a philosopher. One, and I gather I gather that both of these are represented in literature. So you occasionally see people say, well, although Socrates it seems at times to appeal to this fallacious principle, he doesn't really, it's playing some other role. Set that aside. One interesting line of research or line of argument in recent work in ancient philosophy is to say Socrates doesn't really appeal to Socrates' fallacy, because while he says things that have the form to know whether F A, you need to know what F is, that's not a perfect translation. That we should understand the term Socrates uses, roughly episteme, in some other way. And that just translating it as the English verb to know doesn't quite get at what's going on. So I sort of found out about this through some nice work that Whitney Schwab, a grad student at Princeton, has been doing. He's running some version of this, but it's a sort of interesting trend going on in the literature for 30 years or more now, actually. So what could Socrates have meant? Well, at this point I want to sort of leave aside all questions of interpretation and ask because not my field, but I want to ask instead, what principles are there what principles that are in the ballpark could make something like Socrates' principle true? And, as I said, bracket entirely questions of whether you think these are best attributed to Socrates. But here's a couple of principles you might think are at least plausible. To understand whether A is F, you need to understand what F is, right? So again, I can know that punching someone in the face for no reason is wrong, but maybe to sort of understand that truth, I need to understand what wrongness is. Or to finish philosophical inquiry into whether something is the case, you need to first finish into whether some proposition is true. You need to finish philosophical inquiry into what F is. So again, the thought is, it's true that it seems it's a sort of good old Morean fact that punching someone in the face is wrong, but maybe to really sort of settle this philosophically, we need to go through settling what wrongness is. Those principles strike me as plausible, but I also think that they're wrong. And I think that, so here's my sort of grandiose historical speculation, that what's characteristic of the recent era is that philosophers have become much more prepared to reject this whole family of principles. I mean, philosophers, being sensible, rarely thought that the version stated in terms of knowledge was true. But I think these alternatives would have had much more uptake before the recent time. And instead, I think, philosophers in the recent period have been much more willing, not universally, but nothing's ever universal, been much more willing to say, no, we can just run a full-blown philosophical inquiry into whether A is F as a means to furthering inquiry into what F is, and not as an inquiry that has to first answer what F is. And so then think through a whole bunch of the sort of famous cases from Perry's shopper with the trail of sugar running around behind him, from Burge's patient who insists that he's got arthritis, from Judith Thompson's runaway trolleys that we stop in various means, or her violinist who needs to be plugged into a person to survive, or Jackson's Mary in a black and white room, or the versions of the people who aren't quite sure whether the bank is open tomorrow. There's versions of this in DeRose and in Cohen and in Stanley, or John McFarlane's sort of motivations for relativism by thinking about eavesdropping cases. As Herman sort of shows in his book, I mean, Herman discusses, I think, the majority of these cases. These cases are argued about. It's true that you're meant to have a first-pass reaction to them, and that first-pass reaction is meant to support the views that the philosopher in question is trying to get. But that's not the end of the story. We keep on going. I mean, there was a interesting, volume of papers on the Mary case published a few years ago. They weren't appealing to raw intuitions about the case, but nor were they saying that the case is irrelevant. They were arguing about the case, and they were arguing about the case as a means to furthering our understanding of some of the properties and concepts involved. So okay, so that's the big sort of background speculation that I want to give, that philosophers, that what's distinctive about contemporary work is this much higher priority to work on cases, and that arguing about particular cases is a means to going further. And just so one last thought to back up this thought that it's about the cases themselves a means to an end. It's not like these cases are on the whole intrinsically interesting. We're not going to find ourselves plugged into a famous violinist or stopping runaway trolley cars or the like. It's not that we are doing inquiry into goodness or into duty as a means to solving these cases. If we had a full working theory of self-locating belief, going back and saying what it implied about Perry's shopper would be the least of our interests. Rather, what we care about is thinking hard about the cases as a means to further understanding what's going on in with the key concepts. And that's the sort of anti-Socratic nature of recent work, I think. Okay, so with that all as background, let's talk a bit more directly about the book. So a lot of the book, I keep going back and forth between saying Herman's book and Cappelen's book, I probably keep doing that, is devoted to rejecting this view he calls centrality. And centrality is meant to be a view about the role of intuitions in philosophy, and it has these three parts. The claim that intuitions have a certain phenomenology, that intuitive judgments, this claim called Rock, that intuitive judgments have a special epistemic status. The quote given here, and this is, so I'm going to fuss a lot about the sort of versions of F2. So what I'm going to start with is this thought that intuitive judgments justify, but they need no justification. I'm going to defend a version of that while rejecting a lot of centrality. And the third claim is conceptual, that a judgment's an intuition only if it's justified solely by the subject's conceptual competence. And then the sort of the big picture of centrality is intuitions understood in this way are central to philosophical work. I would add to this a fourth characteristic of intuitions. Actually, I'd add a second, because I'm going to reject one and three, but that intuitions are fast. That what I mean, when we talk about intuitions, what we mean are literally snap reactions. If you spend years thinking about the Mary case and looking at the various sort of ways of understanding what's going on and conclude at the end of a long inquiry that Mary does really come to get new propositional knowledge as a result of leaving the room, that's not an intuition in my sense. You might have started with an intuition to that extent too, but the conclusion of that is not an intuition. Rather, it's just that quick snap reaction. And Jennifer Nagel has quite a lot of work on intuitions understood in roughly this way that I'm intending to sort of borrow from / incorporate / steal. Okay. So then on back to Herman. I don't. So this point that intuitions have a phenomenology is, I think, is meant to be due to George Bieler, and I sort of don't get it. I mean, if you ask me what's in common phenomenologically to my snap judgments about Perry's supermarket shopper and Thompson's trolley cases, I get nothing at all, because there is a phenomenology to some of those ethical cases. I have feelings of revulsion in some cases, of guilt or shame or being torn, and in some cases I feel nothing at all. It's like, oh yeah, that's a cause, that's a belief, and so forth. And there's just nothing unified there. And the view seems so implausible to me that I'm worried that I'm missing something. But I also sort of suspect what's gone on is people have generalized from too few cases. Set that aside, so I have nothing really interesting to say about it. The conceptual point I think is more important. And here I'm just going to agree entirely with some stuff Herman says. So, look, if philosophy is meant to be based around evidence that comes from conceptual competencies, then you should think that what we can do in philosophy is answer conceptual questions, and that philosophy should be, if not restricted, then have as a fairly central part of it questions that can be answered purely conceptually. But quick modus tollens of that, if that were right, there's a whole bunch of things that just couldn't be part of philosophy. So I mean, here's a few questions that actually, let's just go through the ones I had. So Herman has a bunch of questions, which I guess I can leave out, that would be hence out of philosophy if that were true. Here's a few more that you couldn't philosophical questions you couldn't possibly answer by just appealing to concepts. Do bans on pornography involve trading off speech rights versus welfare, or do they just involve evaluating the free speech interests of different groups? Is it permissible to eat whales? And it's something that gets debated from time to time, and people go to see us in. Under what circumstances is it permissible to end a terminally ill patient's life or to withhold life-saving treatment? Is context dependency in natural language traceable to the presence of bindable variables? Does belief have a phenomenology? Which animals and which non-animals have beliefs? Look, these all strike me as paradigmatic philosophical questions, and questions which just like reflection on conceptual truths is going to get you very, very little of the way towards solving, because they're just also all a posteriori questions. You need to know a lot about whales before you can know whether it's permissible to eat whales. You need to know a ton about human natural languages to know how much context dependency can be traced to bindable variables. I mean, this is, but that doesn't make those non-philosophical. There's a possible reaction to this that people have, which is to say, to divide up philosophical questions into core and non-core questions, and say, well, maybe you're right, maybe that there's some stuff where we need empirical evidence to answer philosophical questions, but really what's core philosophically are questions that can be answered just by these sort of appeal to conceptual truths. And again, I think that's sort of wrong, and it's sort of, again, sort of historically important that it's wrong. It's it's true that political philosophy became for a while less central to philosophy than it was for, Plato and Locke and Hume and several others. But this sort of seems to me to be something an aberration, something of a mistake. There's a whole lot of questions which are just clearly philosophical questions, which in political philosophy, and that seem to me to be as central as anything to philosophy. I mean, questions about how humans, as we are, should organize our lives together and coordinate seem to be philosophical questions, and the questions you just can't answer by just appealing to conceptual truths. It would perhaps be a helpful myth. It would be quite helpful to me, actually, if it turned out that questions that you can answer by sort of armchair reflection on sort of a priori truths were more central to philosophy, because it would make a lot of what I do more paradigmatically philosophical than what a lot of my friends do. But I don't think that makes it true. So okay, so that's all to say, to sort of bring up and very quickly dismiss the thought that intuitions understood as that intuitions are central to philosophy, and certainly that intuitions understood as revelations of conceptual truths can be central to philosophy. But having said that, I do think there's a role, a larger role for something like intuitions in philosophy. They're not going to be central, they're going to be one source among many. They're not going to be a priori, but they're going to be there. So let's say a bit about that, and eventually a bit more about the Meno too. So humans are great at discriminating among things, and humans develop skills at discrimination from startlingly young ages. These discriminatory capacities tend to go well beyond sort of things that a simple positivist would have called observational properties, and they go well beyond things that we have sort of any deep theoretical understanding of. Very young children can distinguish between correlation and causation without having anything like a worked out theory of causation. But they can, if you show them a correlation that is that can be screened off under more careful circumstances, they'll go, oh, that's not a cause. And that's not. They might not use the word cause because they might not have that, but they'll know to that changing A doesn't bring about a change in B, even if changes in A and B are correlated, if there's independent evidence that the correlation isn't itself a causal one. And so there's some quite fancy stuff going on there. It seems to me that what happens is we develop a lot of skills at picking out, telling right from wrong, skills at telling. I'll give another example from children. Children are very good from a very young age at knowing not just what's right and wrong, but at knowing which things can be made right or wrong by someone saying so. That you can know that, even if you're not supposed to normally wear your snowshoes in their house, that if, some people say, oh, it's okay to wear snowshoes in the house today, it's okay to wear snowshoes in the house today, but even if teacher or parent says so, it doesn't make it okay to, punch your friend in the face. I mean, maybe not as young as 2.5 for some of these, but children pick up some of these quite subtle things quite young. It seems basically what they're picking up are skills. Now, it's going to be kind of important to the story I'm going to tell here to understand these skills as something just like as something pre-propositional, as something just like a competency. Carlotta Pavesi at Rutgers has this impressive work arguing that all human skills are really sort of manifestations of knowledge. If what she says is right, then a lot of what I'm going to say isn't going to be right. So rather than getting into a long debate about that, I'm just going to bring up and set aside a full-blown intellectualism about skills, because I want to think we can rely on skills in areas where we don't know a lot, and we don't even implicitly know a lot. Because what I want to present, and I certainly don't have time or skill to argue for, is that these skills are really like the application of heuristics in Kahneman's sense. That what we've got, what we pick up from a very early age, are some cues that trigger us into recognizing things as right and wrong, as causes or not causes, as knowledge or not knowledge. And these aren't going to be universally valid generalizations. If you tried to write them out as such, they would be false. But if used skillfully, they can give us a lot of knowledge about cases. And that's, I think, important in philosophy. I think we come to philosophy with a lot of skills about how to discriminate between cases, and we apply them. Now, you might think this is kind of a boring result. You might think, look, all this is just a matter of saying that philosophical conversations, like any other conversation, so it says, start with propositions in the common ground, and some of these are not going to be argued for. They're just going to be asserted. But actually, I think philosophy is distinctive in a couple of ways. Like if I can start a philosophical conversation by describing a case to you and trusting that you'll have the same quick snap judgment about it as I do and going on from there. And that'll be something in the common ground. I don't have to start the conversation with an unargued for claim about what I've observed in the Galapagos Islands. I don't have to start with an unobserved observation. I mean, unobserved by you, observation by me. That's how most theorists go about putting unargued for stuff into the common ground, is by telling you what they've seen. Philosophers typically, maybe not universally in the very recent past, but philosophers often don't do that. In a somewhat longer version of this paper, I go into a sort of rather long digression about whether or not these things that we start with should be understood as implicit knowledge or not. This turns out to be kind of non-trivial to resolve, because just where the boundaries are between things that we implicitly know and things that we can be made to know easily is non-trivial. Obviously, if you're a genuine Socratic, you'll think that a lot of these thought experiments are means of recalling things that we learned in a past life and that we genuinely did sort of implicitly know in some thick sense, that they really were already written into our immortal souls. Once you drop the picture of philosophical theorizing starting with recollections from past life, it becomes a little trickier to say exactly where the implicit knowledge new learning boundary is. So I'm just going to say that, just sort of to avoid some of this, have a little bit of stipulative terminology, so that we have a lot of what I call Socratic knowledge. And Socratic knowledge is, we have Socratic knowledge of a proposition, which really, as soon as you're asked to consider the proposition, you can come to see that it's true, and come to not just see that it's true, but come to know that it's true. And so when someone gives you a thought experiment designed in just the right way, you can just immediately go, oh, that's true. And then that's something that you know is true. So I think having these skills we have, the skills that young children have to tell causation from correlation, right from wrong, etc., gives them a lot of Socratic knowledge, even if they hadn't gone through the step of applying it yet. Okay. And Socratic knowledge is useful for trying to figure out what's special about philosophy. Because it's certainly not true that what's special about philosophy is that we use intuitions as I've described them. Every discipline, as far as I know, uses intuitions. So a little toy example. Imagine someone had a theory that said the average British man had a higher standard of living in 1915 than in 1935, in the middle of the Depression. I can actually sort of imagine how, if you sort of looked at the statistics in just the wrong way, you could come up with that. I think it would be just a completely good response to that economic theory to say, look, in 1915, like a massive portion of British men were living in trenches on the Western Front and intuitively had about as low a standard of living as you can imagine. The Depression was pretty horrible. Trench warfare was somewhat worse. If your theory doesn't reflect that, I'm just going to assume that something has gone wrong, and that just feels like a raw, just an intuition, and it feels like a perfectly valid use of one to me. So it's not that. So even if philosophers use intuitions in the sense I've been applying here, it's hardly unique. And indeed, this kind of it's completely commonplace in all sorts of disciplines to say, here's a bunch of data I've got. Here are a bunch of sort of logically possible explanations for this, but really the most likely one looks to be just this particular one, and that's just an intuition, and a good one too. That's good science. So if not intuitions, what is distinctive of philosophy? Well, it's hard to say that what's distinctive of philosophy is its subject matter. I'm at the University of Michigan. The department's on a big long corridor. If you walk up and down the corridor, you can say, oh, let's see, that person works on the sort of nature and moral concepts. That person works on semantic theorizing. That person works on the history of political liberalism. That person works on philosophy of quantum mechanics. That person works on aesthetics. You've only got halfway down the corridor. It's not exactly clear what's meant to be common to all these, to all of us. Us folk. It's certainly not that what's distinctive about philosophy is that we do a priori work. I mean, that's neither necessary nor sufficient for being a philosopher. I'm pretty sure that very little of what my colleagues who work on philosophy of quantum mechanics do is a priori knowledge. On the other hand, a lot of what mathematicians do is a priori knowledge. It's not true that what we do is distinctively modal. If it turns out to be true that all context dependency in natural language is traceable to the presence of bindable variables, that's certainly not a necessary truth. On the other hand, it's possibly true that some of the work historians do does discover necessary truths about family dependencies. And it's not that philosophy is distinctively deep. And in fact, a quick casual perusal of my written work over the years should reassure you that philosophy doesn't do stuff that's deep, and a lot of other disciplines do stuff that I think is very deep. I mean, work about why it is that humans have the biological properties they do, which kind of organizational and political structures are good for human flourishing and which aren't, seem like paradigmatically deep questions to me. And while they're questions philosophers can inform, they're not necessarily questions that are thoroughgoingly philosophical. So if not that, then what? Well, here's a stab at an answer. Philosophical questions are, well, let's try a theory that doesn't work, and then I'll try and correct it. So philosophical questions are ones you can answer with Socratic knowledge. That is, philosophical questions are ones where, if you just bring what you bring to the table, not a priori knowledge, but bring your just general purpose skills as a developed human in skills at classification along, and you'll be able to answer things. Well, that doesn't quite work, because of course there's lots of philosophical work that's informed by empirical research. But perhaps I think we can, if we weaken it a little bit, if you say philosophical questions are ones where this kind of Socratic knowledge can get you a long way, or at least a bunch of people think you can answer them entirely with Socratic knowledge, or at least at some point in the relatively recent past, a lot of people thought you could answer them entirely with Socratic knowledge, and the questions had stayed around in philosophy for a few years because of inertia. I think you get something that's much closer to covering the field. Philosophers start their conversations with things that can be quickly accepted, or at least they work on questions where a lot of people thought that way. I mean, it's an important part of philosophy, not just of the present, but at all periods, that there were always people who thought, look, this question isn't, we're not getting very far in the seminar room here. This is something you got to go and roll your sleeves up and get information about. Because we're not always right about what can be done with Socratic knowledge. But the standard case is we're wrong. And when we're wrong, what happens a lot of the times is disciplines break off from philosophy. So you see sort of economics, psychology, cog-sci, cog-sci is actually a bit more complicated, but you see economics and psychology in recent times just breaking out from philosophy, and in part you see them breaking out at the point where people thought much more worldly investigation was needed. You couldn't just sit back and reflect on stuff. I don't know as much about the history of psychology, but I think the history of economics is kind of instructive here. The big breaks you see, first with Adam Smith's other less philosophical book that seemed to have a little more influence, and then even more so with Alfred Marshall breaking off the economics tripos from the philosophy tripos at Cambridge. This was all related to thoughts that economic work was work that was done in part by lots of grinding observations. Smith and Marshall were both empirical researchers. That bit where Smith describes how a pin factory works is not the kind of thing you found in a typical philosophy book, although the questions Smith was asking and trying to answer were questions that, up to that time, we found in typical philosophical work. If you look back at the history of economics before Smith, you see a lot of names that are pretty familiar. You see Hume, you see Locke. You see it wasn't that questions economists answer weren't questions that philosophers cared about. It was that, if you can answer these questions in just the same way that you do metaphysics and epistemology, then you're doing philosophy, and that's what Hume and Locke did. Okay, so that's like sort of big picture theory, that what philosophers do is bring a lot of their skills that are grounded in observation, and perhaps observation you make as a very little, wee toddler, to bear, and they address questions that, at least historically, at least a lot of people historically have thought that just those kind of skills can answer. Okay, bringing this a little back to Herman's book. So that makes me think intuitions can play a role in philosophy. I sort of even think they can have, in some sense, a role as being a strong source of intuitions, a strong source of evidence. Though this requires a bit of a distinction. So what I want to talk about for the next few minutes is this question on the slide, how important epistemically are intuitions? And I think this requires something of a distinction that's quite important to understanding the kind of conservative epistemology that Gil Harman has, or the dogmatic epistemology that Jim Pryor has, and the like. So when we talk about the importance of an evidential source, we could mean two distinct things. One is we could talk about how strong a doxastic state supported by the evidence. And second, we could talk about the resilience of the source of evidence in the face of counter-evidence. Now, these two can come apart dramatically. So, a conservative epistemology says, look, that you previously believed that P is just perfectly good reason to believe that P, and indeed might be sufficient for you to know that P, but, a very small amount of evidence to the contrary, and you should start rethinking your view. And similarly, Pryor's dogmatist thinks appearance that P can ground knowledge that P, but you don't need much counter evidence before you should start thinking, gee, I wonder if I've got good enough grounds to believe that. So a bit of stipulated terminology. Some evidence is strong, as I'll use the term strong, just in case it supports a strong attitude. What do I mean by a strong attitude? I mean, certainty is a stronger attitude than knowledge, is a stronger attitude than high credence, is a stronger attitude than more probable than not. Knowledge, I think, is pretty high up that list. And we'll say evidence is resilient if it retains its strength in the face of a wide range of counter-evidence, and the contrast being fragile. So then, picture to put forward, intuitions are strong but fragile. You can, just by thinking about a case, come to knowledge. But it doesn't take much to overturn that. That's going to be the view. They're strong enough that they can genuinely be unjustified justifiers. So you can just think about a case, go, that would be wrong to perform that action, and bingo, you know that it's wrong. But it doesn't take a lot if someone has even a halfway decent argument that it wouldn't be wrong. Then you better not just thump the table and insist, oh no, it's I can tell by the pure light of reason that it's wrong. So this is to agree with the letter of what Herman wrote as his second characteristic, that intuitions can be unjustified justifiers, though perhaps not with the spirit of it. Okay. Herman goes on to give some diagnostics for whether intuitions can genuinely have this rock status, so they can be unjustified justifiers. I've actually been agreeing a lot with Herman so far, so this is time to have a little bit of quibbling. So one of the diagnostics he gives is this evidence recalcitrance. Intuitions are evidence recalcitrant. Holders of them are not disposed to give them up, even when their best arguments for those intuitions are shown to fail. So this is actually a very specific kind of recalcitrance. It's not that. So what Herman's interested in here isn't whether people give up or hold on to their intuitions in the face of counter arguments. It's whether they hold on to or give up their intuitions in the face of losing their best arguments for them. But I think there's something right to this, or at least there's something in the vicinity that I think is right. I think in a lot of cases, holders of intuitions are justified in being more confident in the intuition's correctness than they are in the best arguments for that intuition. So the paradigm here, which is for reasons we'll get to at the end, not a perfect paradigm, is probably the Gettier case. So remember, Gettier's original paper has a couple of little arguments that the famous cases he discusses are not knowledge. They're not great arguments, you know. There's basically an appeal to a no false lemmas premise as the main argument that's given, and that's probably not a good premise. But no matter, I think anyone who read the paper was justified in accepting the conclusions about the cases more so than they were justified in believing the arguments. There's another diagnostic that Herman gives that I want to more strongly disagree with. He says that if evidence is given for P in a context, that's evidence that P isn't an unjustified justifier in the context. And this doesn't strike me as right at all. Here's a little toy example. A says, is John happiness a well-formed sentence? And B replies, no, it doesn't have a verb. Now, I think what's gone on there in B's reply is that B has announced an intuition that John happiness is not a well-formed sentence, and has given a little argument for that intuition. And it's not actually a great argument, to be honest. I mean, it's, Quine uses, lo gavagai as one of his examples of a sentence which doesn't have a verb. And it's not, there's something a bit weird about Quine's sentences, but it's not clear to me that he's wrong. And those could be sentences. It is clear to me that John happiness is not a well-formed sentence. Right? It's kind of interesting that it's not a well-formed sentence. It sort of raises problems for some theories about the unity of the proposition that it's not well-formed, but it's not well-formed. And my intuition, I think, B's first response, that no is justified, and I think it's an unjustified justifier, and even though B is attempted to, in this case, somewhat incompetently argue for it. That's, I think, the very common position we find ourselves in philosophy, that we give a response, we are inclined to want to try and say something in defense of that response, that often the things we say will be less compelling, less worked out than the response itself. So the fact that B tries to defend their answer here doesn't mean that their answer isn't an unjustified justifier. Okay. Despite all that, I have been conceding that intuition is a very fragile evidence. And should check. When am I to finish up, by the way?
About 2 or 3 minutes. Would that be good?
Okay.
Take 5. We started a bit later. Take 5.
I think there's quite a bit left.
Well, no, that's okay. I was just trying to make two decisions. Short version is, even though intuitions I think are quite fragile, I think, if someone comes up with an argument against them, I think they're helpful for a few reasons. One is, they just help, as we'll see in a little bit, they help just cut down the space that we have to work through. Another thing is, it's just helpful to have a check on our reasoning from time to time. And have something like, independent checks are just inherently good things, even in areas where the checks are in some ways less reliable than what they're being checked. Okay, that is a long-worked example here that I'm not going to due to Ben Levinson, that I'm just going to leave out, though it's sort of fascinating. So what I want to get to is, I've been sort of saying, speaking at a very high level of generalization about some philosophical questions. And I've been doing so while saying that philosophers don't these days speak at high levels of generalization about questions. I want to resolve the performative contradiction. So by using some case studies, and since it's the area of recent philosophical work I know best, the case studies are going to be from David Lewis. So when I read Philosophy Without Intuitions the first time, my first thought was, yeah, I bet Lewis isn't going to work out particularly smoothly as an instance of someone fitting the mold of what Cappelen talks about here. I would have thought, gee, there's just intuitions about cases being thrown around all the time, and not in the way Cappelen talks about. And when I went back and read carefully, it turned out this was wrong. That in fact, that a lot of what Lewis does fit the paradigm that Cappelen gives. That cases are brought up all the time, all right, but it's not that that snap judgments about them are used as grounds for stopping debate. So, really striking paradigm, really striking example of this was the cases in Finkish dispositions. I sort of, my simple memory of Finkish dispositions was that it starts with some examples Charlie Martin had that were just meant to be used as Gettier-like counterexamples to a simple conditional analysis of dispositions. But that's not at all the presentation you get in Lewis. What you get, you get Martin-style examples brought up, all right, and then he gives you an argument, and something he is quite clearly presented as an argument for Martin's conclusion about the case. And Lewis even says at one point, that he's wielding an assumption to get the conclusion, the assumption being actually a quite implausible assumption that dispositions depended on the intrinsic properties of the object. So it's true that there are case studies all through Lewis, but what happens over and over again is you get arguments for them, and not just arguments like the it doesn't have a verb type argument. Actually, quite developed arguments that I think are meant to bear a lot of the weight. This isn't always the case. There certainly are examples in Lewis of just snap appeals to intuitions where you describe a case, you expect everyone who reads it will have the same judgment about it, and that's used as a debate stopper and move on. So here's the causation as influence has a ton of these. So here's the Chancy bomb case. There are bombs put on two planes. One of them, they're both sort of probabilistic bombs. They're both sort of some reason have been hooked up to sort of quantum devices. One of them goes off, the other doesn't. The headline appears in the paper the next day. Bomb explodes on plane. Question: did putting the consider the bomb that didn't explode? Is putting that bomb on the plane a cause of that newspaper headline? Intuitive answer: no. And that shows that probability raising isn't sufficient for causation, because putting that unexploded bomb on the plane did raise the probability that there'd be a headline in the paper the next day saying bomb explodes on plane, but isn't a cause of it. End of discussion. There's not like there's any further argument there. It's this case, and they could run through a handful of others from the paper, is, in fact, not only is there no argument there, there's like a theory that you can sort of see forming that all of a sudden is just wiped out by one neat example. That happens, and it happens a bit in the causation literature, but it's actually kind of unusual, and I think it's related to Lewis's eliminativism, for want of a better word, about causation. He thinks causation doesn't really exist, and what we have to do is explain causal talk, not say what causation is. Much more common are some other kinds of cases. So here are four sort of distinct roles we see for examples just in Lewis. So there's refutations of theories, like in the Chancy bomb case. There's illustrations that I think are really meant to help explain what's going on in an argument that you could have retrospectively come back and rewritten without the examples at all. It's quite easy to get to the end of Finkish dispositions and say, oh, here's the argument against the conditional analysis, and not mention Finks at all. It's that dispositions are meant to supervene on intrinsic properties, the truth of the conditionals doesn't, so dispositions can't be the truth of the conditionals. Similarly, in the puzzling Pierre case, you're certainly not meant to have intuitions about Pierre and just go on. You're meant to argue about it. There's sort of tools for sort of showing you how to make certain distinctions. That's in the Trapp's dilemma. There's these interesting, simplified versions of the real world. Category 4 is really fascinating because it links up to some stuff Robert Sugden's done on arguing that the way we reason from thought experiments is by something like reasoning by analogy. We say, oh, the real world's kind of like this fictional case in at least the key respects, and so what's true of the fictional case is true in the real world. And that's pretty clearly what's going on in the thought experiments in naming the colours. the type 1 cases, the sort of paradigms of thought experiments that stop a theory, are, as far as I can tell, never central to a paper. I don't think there's any paper in Lewis that has. I don't want to sort of commit to the universal, but they're not the things that you don't just like write a paper with just one case study based around. They're actually not that memorable even. The cases that stop a theory are the ones that you only remember if you have really been working on that thing. The cases that you remember as philosophers, just general well-informed philosophers, tend to be ones people argue about, not what they intuit about. Okay, so actually I think that's really quite nice, I think, for the big picture story here. I disagree with that philosophy should be without intuitions. I think the Clancy-Bomb case is a perfectly good appeal to intuition. It was a good bit of philosophy, and it was using something I call an intuition. But I agree they're not central. Okay, some conclusions. So this kind of Socratic knowledge, I think, is important to philosophy. It's important, it helps us do philosophy, and it helps characterize what we do in philosophy, at least in the sense that some people some of the time think you can get by answering philosophical questions Socratically. Intuitions play a role in philosophy, but they're not conceptual competencies, they're manifestations of skills that we acquire either innately or through observation from a very young age, hopefully not from recollection from past lives. They're mostly a posteriori. I just don't see any reason to think that the child who comes to be able to make distinctions between causation and correlation is appealing to some a priori insight. They've seen lots of examples of what kind of thing makes the toy turn on and what doesn't, and they're relying on this. Not huge reason to think that we can do a whole lot better given the absence of a worked out theory of causation. When these intuitions do come in, I think they're default justified, that is, they're unjustified justifiers. You might worry there's a bit of a tension there. I mean, there's a sense in which, look, there's a tension between 4 and 5. You might worry that intuitions are justified by the observations that led to your development of the skill. But and if you wanted to use justified that way, there might just be a sort of a terminological dispute here. It's true that we develop our discriminatory skills by observation, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that the beliefs we get from those skills are justified by those observations. The amount of justification we get is, that's an error on the slide, isn't it? What I should be saying there is fragile, because actually I think it's, the intuitions can be overridden, and because intuitions are fragile, they're very rarely central. It's just not that common that a snap appeal to judgments is driving philosophical work. So contra Cappelen, I think the intuitions do play a role, but it's a small sort of moving the ball forward kind of role. It's not a showstopper role. It's the cases that are forgotten about by all but the condescending that are the intuitions. Now, to end with, you might think, look, everything he's just said is obviously wrong, and it's obviously wrong because Gettier. That the Gettier cases are cases that we all know about. They were obviously, used as sort of showstoppers. That I've just been way too concessive. Gettier shows this is wrong. In the book, there's a rather longish footnote about why the Gettier literature is weird and abnormal, and that we shouldn't be generalizing too much from it. And I agree that the Gettier literature is weird and abnormal, and we shouldn't be generalizing too much from it. And I basically agree that the story I've been telling about philosophy is just false as applied to that little bit of the literature. And I feel fine with that, because I think in some ways, not just was the Gettier literature, especially the stuff up through Schoep's book, where you just have case after case after case. Not only was it abnormal, I don't think it was particularly good philosophy in the following sense. We got a lot out of it eventually, but not directly. So you've got the Gettier cases. They're really fascinating. It's here's what, as far as I can tell, philosophers in almost any other field would have done. Been like, oh, that's really interesting. Those look like they should be knowledge, but they're not. Why aren't they? That's an interesting question. Why aren't the Gettier cases knowledge? That wasn't the question that was asked. The question instead that was asked was, oh, our old analysis of knowledge failed, so what's the right one instead? I mean, that's the kind of question Socrates might have tried to press on you at that point. But those are importantly different questions. I think we kind of know what's wrong about the Gettier cases. They're not safe. And the development of safety theories through, I mean, actually, there's a side mention of something like a safety theoretic explanation of the Gettier cases in elusive knowledge, but then obviously much more systematic development of this thought in Williamson. That feels like an explanation of what's gone on there. Not an explanation that's received universal assent, but I think a pretty good explanation of what's gone on there. It's not an explanation that requires you to have an alternative analysis of knowledge, and in fact, most of the people who put forward a safety-based explanation of the Gettier cases disavow any analysis of knowledge. But it's a good explanation. It's a really striking feature of the immediate sort of post-1963 literature on knowledge that it just didn't go that way. That the question of what explains these cases as distinct from the question of what's the alternative but correct analysis of knowledge wasn't directly put forward. It's that difference, I think, that makes the Gettier literature so distinctive, and why I'm happy enough to put forward a general theory of philosophy that has one glaring counterexample to it. That's all.
Thank you.